Hey, you're about to spend a lot of money protecting the paint on your brand new vehicle. I'm gonna show you what sets Harker Heights ceramic coatings above the rest and what you're gonna get for your money that's different from other shops. The first thing to understand is that no installation is completely perfect. So it is normal to get a little bit of debris under the film, maybe have an occasional line. It is normal to have to go back and have some areas of the vehicle trimmed at the multi-week mark, like 2 weeks, but not to the extent that I'm gonna show you today. All right, the first thing I'm going to show you is what's called lift lines. These lines are all over this hood in particular, and some on the fenders, but this comes from the film being squeegeed or tacked down at a different spot or dried, and then lifted back up without lifting to a hard body line, and it leaves these permanent marks in the film. Now, it may be hard to see on the camera, but there are a lot of distortions on this hood right in here. And this is also all over the hood. It is easier to see in person than it is on camera. But this is distorted adhesive, and that usually happens from either stretching the film once it's dried or tacked down, or squeegeeing over air or overstretching. There's a number of ways to distort the adhesive in film, but that's not gonna come off. You can see some more of that adhesive distortion through here. And of course we got some more hard lift lines and distortion, which is all over the edges of this hood. Most likely the hood was stretched but not in the correct direction, and the film lifted up, and then they attempted to put it right back down. Now, like I mentioned, you know, it is possible to get the occasional line, and no installation is perfect. But at a certain point, they become excessive enough that you don't want it to leave the shop. What you're seeing here is misaligned film. So this piece, this cutout, was not deleted when they printed the pattern, and it had a cutout in the software, which, you know, goes right here. Well, the problem is it's not aligned properly. So you see that extra line, that's actually the film up over this side marker, and then you notice at the top, it's above the side marker. Now this gap isn't necessarily bad, but this should definitely be trimmed to match. This is just overhanging film that's eventually gonna lift up. And you can see it is actually lifting up there on the edge. This is harder to show on camera because of the angle, but you see where this is lifted up. This film is actually not lifted up, it's bunched on itself. They should have wrapped it around the edge, but it got caught, and you know, sometimes that does happen, but what you need to do is release it and then put it back down. Now this is sat here and cured, adhered to itself, and if we try to separate that, it's 99 times out of 100, the adhesive is going to separate from the backing because it's two pieces of glue stuck to one another. I want to contrast this to my personal vehicle that I have done. You can see we've wrapped this down here on the edge, and if you're looking from the side, that's just a piece of dirt. If you're looking from the side, you can't even tell it's been wrapped. Next thing I want to show you is the underside of the hood. Now, a lot of times we wrap the edge of the hood, and we may get some of these are called fingers, we may get some of these under, but you notice how these fingers were not addressed, and so they go all the way to the edge of the film. It's dirty. It may be able to be cleaned and laid back down, but it hasn't been stretched properly. There's too much film here, and that goes pretty much for the whole way around. Now, some of this is cleared up during your trim appointment, but most of it anyways, should be trimmed and cleared up prior to even leaving the shop. And that is because what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to have this lift up like this, get dirty, maybe the adhesive gets ruined, and then it won't lay back down. And you see how it's like right to the edge. So if that adhesive is damaged right there, we'll have to trim it back, and then there'll be an exposed piece. Now, I'm not necessarily worried about that getting hit with a rock, but at a certain point, it'll continue to lift, or it could lift a little bit further, and now it's exposed. And we, of course, wrap all of our edges, and we post-heat all of our edges. This was pushed under, and it doesn't appear to even have been trimmed. And we, of course, are going to trim that, and it may need to get, you know, kind of touched up at a certain point, especially these areas which are hard to reach and angle, but it shouldn't be to this extent. Now again, I want to contrast this with my own install. You see there's a notch there so we don't get a bunch, and it's not exposed, you can't see it. And then I've trimmed it, I've tucked it and trimmed it all along this edge here. And you notice there's no excess material. Now all of our patterns, we try to wrap the edges, which means we wrap it over the edge so it's not exposed. We do that the best we can. It's not always the case. And it looks like that's what they tried to do here, but you notice there's so much additional material. They just kind of put it down there. It's not trimmed, it's not nicely trimmed, so it leaves these giant air bubbles. Now you can see we don't have those air bubbles here because I've trimmed this line right here in the nook of this fender, inside fender on my car, so that it doesn't have those air bubbles, doesn't have that lifting, and it's not unsightly when you lift the hood. Next thing I want to show you is the sensor cutout. So by default, you're going to delete the sensors from the pattern. You're going to PPF over this area, and then you're going to trim it out. Well, this is just a kind of probably either an unsteady or inexperienced hand. You can see where they made multiple cuts, but they didn't kind of clean it out. Now, sometimes you make a mistake on a cut, but you still gotta even it out, so it doesn't have this jagged appearance, which is just going to continue to lift and collect dirt. Now contrast that with the sensor cutout I did on my Cadillac here. You can see there's no real jagged edges. There's a little mini jagged edge down here, but that's actually the manufacturer paint is kind of thin in that area. But you notice that there's not like a bunch of jagged edges. And this is what the sensor looked like before I cut it out. So this actually hasn't been cut out. This has film directly over top of it, and then I cut in this circle to make it look like that. Now, probably one of the most time-consuming things about a PPF install is, going over it after it's dried and trimming back stuff like this. You see how it's overlapped onto the textured plastic. It's lifted up right there. That's all air and dirt trapped underneath it. This giant air bubble here, you can see in other areas where the film was just overlaid and hasn't been trimmed back. And some of this, may be normal and come up during that 2-week inspection, but this has an excessive amount of it. And we spend a lot of time here going over this stuff before we deliver it to you. Here's some more areas. You can see, this was almost similar to the driver door that we talked about earlier, where it like folded and then it was just kind of sent off. We can fix some of this stuff, but again, once adhesive starts getting attached to itself, it's not pretty. Now you can compare this to our install. See, there's like a factory lip there, and so if I tried to overlay this, it would have an air gap. So I've trimmed it right up to the edge of this factory mold, and you can kind of see how we don't really have that issue here of excess material hanging off. Ultimately, you have to do what's right for you and your budget, but just understand that there are definite trade-offs when you look at other shops that may be less expensive, less experienced, or have less attention to detail. And we aren't one of those shops, and we are going to take care of you if we do make a mistake, because we aren't perfect. But I think you'll be much happier choosing us than another shop.